My name is Elena Vance, and this morning I sat across from the two people who gave me life, watching them try to systematically erase it. We were 6 feet apart in courtroom 4C, a room that smelled of floor wax and cold, hard indifference. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of angry hornets, sharp and sterile, while the bailiff's voice droned on, calling a case that felt like a death sentence. On the plaintiff's side sat Thomas and Elena Vance, my parents. On the defense, there was only me. No lawyer, no entourage, just a woman in a charcoal suit holding onto a truth that felt heavier than the world. They weren't just suing me for money, they were suing me for fraud. They were claiming I had stolen the identity of a fallen soldier to collect veteran benefits. They were telling the world that the last 5 years of my life, the scars, the nightmares, the missing pieces of my soul were nothing more than a calculated lie. They didn't even look at me. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was an embarrassment they wanted to bury under a mountain of legal paperwork. The air in the room felt thin as their attorney stood up, his voice smooth as silk and twice as deadly. He began to paint a picture of a delusional girl, a daughter so desperate for attention that she'd fabricated an entire military career out of thin air. He spoke about the absence of public records, the lack of photos on social media, and the mysterious black hole in my employment history. He called me a phantom, a ghost who had haunted their family for too long. I stayed silent, my hands folded tightly in my lap. My uniform wasn't on my body. It was tucked away in a cedar chest back in my apartment, smelling of lavender and old dust. But beneath the fabric of my suit, I could still feel the phantom itch of my combat gear. I could still taste the copper tang of the dust in the Helmand province and hear the rhythmic thud of the rotors from a medevac unit. They thought my silence was an admission of guilt. They thought because I wouldn't scream, I had no voice left. Growing up in the Vance household was like living in a gallery where only the perfect pieces were put on display. My brother Julian was the masterpiece, Ivy League, corporate law, the golden child who never let a hair fall out of place. I was the rough draft, the one with too many questions and a heart that didn't fit into their narrow corridors of expectations. When I enlisted at 18, they didn't throw a party. My mother didn't cry. She just stood by the door with a look of profound disappointment, as if I were a stain she couldn't quite scrub out. My father's only words were a warning, "Don't you dare embarrass this family, Elena." They told the neighbors I was traveling, finding myself in Europe. They erased my service before I even finished basic training. They didn't want a soldier for a daughter, they wanted a ghost. And now in this courtroom, they were finally trying to make that ghost official. The attorney's voice continued to slice through the air, sharp as a surgical scalpel. He presented a series of financial records, highlighting the monthly disability deposits and the subsidized housing credits I had received. He pointed out with a sneer of triumph that the Department of Defense had no Elena Vance listed in their active personnel database for the years in question. To the gallery, it looked like an open and shut case of a grifter preying on a system meant for heroes. I watched my mother Elena adjust her silk scarf. She looked pained, as if my very presence was an assault on her dignity. My father Thomas leaned back, his eyes fixed on the judge with the steady confidence of a man who had never been told no. They had built this narrative with the same precision they used to manage their investment portfolios. They weren't just my parents anymore, they were the architects of my destruction. What they didn't understand, what they refused to acknowledge, was the nature of my service. I hadn't been a clerk or a mechanic. I was part of a forward surgical team attached to a special operations task force in the most volatile sectors of the Middle East. For 3 years, I existed in the shadows. My identity was redacted in mission logs for operational security. My pay was processed through a discretionary fund, and my discharge papers were filed under a classified annex that required a Tier 2 clearance just to view. I had signed my life away to a non-disclosure agreement that felt like a secondary skin. I was a ghost because the government needed me to be one, and my parents were using that shadow as a weapon against me. They took my sacrifice and rebranded it as a lie. I remembered the night that changed everything, the night that left me with a permanent limp and a mind that jumps at the sound of a car backfiring. It was a high-value extraction near the border. The air was thick with the smell of burning diesel and raw fear. When our convoy hit the IED, the world turned into a kaleidoscope of fire and jagged metal. I remember the weight of a wounded captain on my back, the blood soaking through my fatigues, and the frantic, rhythmic chanting of medical codes into a radio that was barely functional. I didn't think about records or benefits then. I only thought about the heartbeat under my hands. I came home 3 years later, not to a parade, but to a cold hallway. I arrived at their door with a duffel bag and a purple heart hidden in the lining of my jacket. My mother didn't ask if I was okay. She asked if I was planning on staying long because they had a dinner party on Saturday. The trial moved into the afternoon session, and the weight of their betrayal began to feel like a physical pressure on my chest. Their lawyer called a distant cousin to the stand, a woman I hadn't seen in a decade, who testified that I had always been prone to vivid imaginings. The audience whispered, their eyes darting toward me with a mixture of pity and disgust. I could see the headlines already forming in the local papers, "The daughter who faked a war." I looked at my father, hoping to find a glimmer of hesitation, a flicker of the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike, but there was nothing. Only the cold, calculating gaze of a man winning a business deal. They had completely disconnected from the flesh and blood woman sitting 6 feet away. To them, I was just a liability that needed to be liquidated. The legal onslaught continued for hours. Their attorney produced a series of medical evaluations from my teenage years, highlighting a bout of anxiety I'd had at 15, twisting it to suggest a lifelong pattern of mental instability. He was good, I had to give him that. He knew how to weave a thread of truth into a blanket of lies. He suggested that my post-traumatic stress wasn't from a battlefield, but from a fractured ego that couldn't handle the real world. I sat there, a silent witness to my own character assassination. Every time I wanted to speak, every time I wanted to scream that I had held the life of a dying soldier in my hands while the world exploded around me, I remembered the papers I had signed. The oath of secrecy was a heavy chain, and my parents were using it to hang me. During a brief recess, I stood in the hallway, staring out a tall window at the city below. People were going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that a woman's entire existence was being dismantled in room 4C. I felt a presence behind me. It was my brother, Julian. He looked polished, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than malice. "You should have just taken the deal, Elena," he said, his voice low. "Dad offered to settle this quietly if you just admitted you misinterpreted your time away. Why make it this ugly?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he truly didn't get it. To him, the truth was a commodity, something to be traded or polished for public consumption. "Because it's not interpretation, Julian," I replied, my voice raspy. "It's what happened." He sighed, shook his head, and walked back into the courtroom, leaving me in the cold shadows of the corridor. When we reconvened, the atmosphere in the room changed. The judge, a woman named Justice Miriam Sterling, had been mostly silent, her face a mask of judicial neutrality. She was a formidable woman with graying hair pulled back into a tight bun and eyes that seemed to see through every facade. She began to review the evidence the plaintiff's attorney had submitted, the lack of Department of Defense records. She leaned forward, her gaze shifting from the lawyer to me. "Miss Vance," she said, her voice echoing in the silent chamber, "your parents' counsel makes a compelling case regarding the absence of your name in traditional military databases. In fact, based on the public record, you do not exist in the capacity you claim." A murmur of satisfaction rippled through my parents' side of the room. My mother leaned into my father's shoulder, a look of relief washing over her face. I felt my heart sink. This was it, the moment where the shadow finally swallowed the person. I had expected the law to be a shield, but it was proving to be the very shovel my parents were using to dig my grave. I looked down at my hands, noticing the small, white scar across my knuckle, a souvenir from a jagged piece of shrapnel in a dusty valley half a world away. I didn't need a database to tell me that scar was real. I didn't need a lawyer to tell me the nightmares were earned. But as I prepared myself for the final blow, Justice Sterling did something unexpected. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked directly at me, and for a split second, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't neutrality, it was recognition. "However," the judge continued, her voice dropping an octave, "the law does not only exist on paper. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that aren't allowed to be written down." She turned her attention to my parents' attorney, who was already starting to pack his briefcase, assuming the victory was his. "Counselor, before we proceed to closing arguments, I have a few questions of my own for the defendant, questions that perhaps only those who have walked in certain boots would know how to answer." The room went dead silent. The smirk on my father's face froze. The air in the courtroom suddenly felt electrified, as if a storm were brewing just behind the judge's bench. Justice Sterling adjusted her glasses, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into a blur. "Miss Vance," she began, "there is a specific type of silence that follows a heavy ordnance blast. It's not just the absence of sound, it's a physical weight. Can you describe the color of the sky in the moments before the dust settles in the Helmand province?" The question was so specific, so visceral that it hit me like a physical blow. The courtroom vanished, replaced by the memory of fire and grit. "It's not blue, Your Honor," I whispered, my voice finally finding its strength. It's a bruised purple choked with a fine ochre dust that tastes like copper and burnt rubber, and the silence it rings. It's a high-pitched hum that stays in your ears long after the screaming starts. A heavy stillness settled over the gallery. My mother shifted in her seat, her brow furrowed in confusion, while my father's jaw tightened. They looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, a dialect of pain they had never bothered to learn. Justice Sterling nodded slowly, a grim shadow of a smile touching her lips. And when the medevac arrives, she continued, what is the first thing the lead technician yells over the rotor wash? I didn't even have to think. They don't yell words, Your Honor, they yell numbers. Triage categories. They scream red for the ones we might save and black for the ones we've already lost. And they always ask for the angel, the medic who kept them breathing until the bird touched down. The plaintiff's attorney jumped to his feet, his face flushed. Your Honor, I must object. This is highly irregular. This isn't a military tribunal, and these anecdotal descriptions are not admissible as evidence against the official Department of Defense records we have provided. Justice Sterling didn't even look at him. She simply raised one hand, and the lawyer sat down as if he'd been shoved. I am establishing the credibility of the witness's lived experience, counselor, she said coldly, something your paperwork seems to have missed. She turned back to me. There was a mission, Miss Vance. July 14th, 4 years ago, a joint task force extraction near a village that doesn't exist on civilian maps. A medic stayed behind to hold a femoral artery shut while the rest of the team took cover from sniper fire. Do you remember the name of the officer she saved? My breath hitched. I remembered the heat of the blood on my hands, the way the sand turned into a dark, wet sludge beneath us. I remembered the woman's face, pale and covered in soot, her eyes wide with the terror of a life slipping away. Her name was Captain Miller, I said, my voice trembling, but she told me to call her Miri if we made it out alive. I told her she wasn't allowed to die because I didn't want to fill out the paperwork. The judge's hand, resting on the bench, curled into a tight fist. For the first time, I saw a flicker of raw emotion break through her professional mask. The room was so quiet you could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I am Miri, the judge said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. The shock that rippled through the courtroom was almost audible. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, and my father surged forward in his seat, his face a mask of sudden, panicked realization. Justice Sterling stood up, the black robes of her office billowing around her like a dark cloud. For 4 years, I have looked for the woman who saved my life. I was told her records were sealed, that her identity was a matter of national security, and that she had vanished back into the civilian world. I never expected to find her here, being hunted by her own flesh and blood for the crime of surviving. She looked down at my parents, her gaze turning into shards of ice. You claim she is a fraud. I am the living, breathing evidence that she is a hero. The courtroom felt like it had been plunged into a vacuum. The air was gone, leaving only the ringing echo of Justice Sterling's revelation. My mother's face, usually so composed and mask-like, began to crumble, the pale foundation of her skin appearing like cracked porcelain. My father looked as though he had been struck by lightning, his mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The perfect case they had built, the mountain of lies they had meticulously stacked against me, was being dismantled by a single, undeniable witness. Their attorney sat frozen, his hand still hovering over a file that now meant absolutely nothing. Justice Sterling didn't sit back down. She remained standing, a towering figure of authority and memory. I spent 6 months in a military hospital, she said, her voice regaining its iron strength. I had plenty of time to think about the medic who refused to let go of my arm even when the mortars were landing close enough to coat us in dirt. I remembered the grit in her voice when she told me to keep my eyes on her. But because of the classification of our unit, because we were operating under a shadow mandate, I was told that the medic Delta Romeo 6 didn't exist on any public roster. I was told that for the sake of the mission, I had to let the memory go. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't invisible. I see now that you were forced to carry that silence alone, Miss Vance, and I see how these people have tried to use that silence to bury you. The plaintiff's attorney finally found his voice, though it was weak and strained. Your Honor, while your personal experience is moving, we must still adhere to the legal definitions of fraud as presented in the civil complaint. The lack of traditional documentation, Justice Sterling cut him off with a look so sharp it could have drawn blood. The documentation you seek, counselor, is currently held in a secure facility that requires a level of authorization you will never possess. However, as a federal appointee with the necessary clearances, I am invoking a judicial inquiry into the sealed records of the 4th Provisional Task Force. She turned her gaze to the court clerk. Get the Department of Defense liaison on the secure line. Tell them Justice Sterling is verifying a combat record for an emergency dismissal. Now, my father finally spoke, his voice a frantic, desperate rasp. This is a mistake. We only wanted what was best for her. We thought she was sick. We thought she was imagining things because she wouldn't show us any proof. It was a pathetic lie, a last-ditch effort to reclaim the moral high ground. He wasn't worried about my health, he was worried about his reputation. He was worried that the world would see him for exactly what he was, a man who would rather sue his daughter for fraud than admit she was braver than he ever could be. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel anger, I felt a cold, distant pity. He had spent his whole life chasing status, and in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own child. The judge didn't acknowledge his outburst. She looked at me, her expression softening just a fraction. The court will be in recess for 1 hour while the records are transmitted via secure channel. Miss Vance, you are not to leave the building. Thomas and Elena Vance, I suggest you spend this hour speaking very honestly with your attorney about the consequences of filing a malicious and perjured civil suit. She slammed the gavel down, and the sound was like a gunshot, signaling the end of the world my parents had built. As the room began to stir with frantic whispers, I stayed in my chair. I watched them scramble, watched them whisper in a panicked huddle, but they felt miles away. I was no longer a ghost. The light was finally beginning to break through the shadows. The hour in recess felt like a lifetime. I sat in the back of the cafeteria, staring at a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Around me, the world continued to spin. Lawyers in expensive shoes hurried by, families argued over custody, and the mundane machinery of the law ground on. But for me, the air had shifted. It was as if a heavy, invisible shroud that I had been wearing since I stepped off that transport plane years ago was finally being lifted. I looked at my hands. They were steady. For the first time since the IED blast, the tremor was gone. I realized then that I hadn't just been fighting my parents. I had been fighting the feeling that I had vanished in that desert, that the version of me who came home was just a hollow shell. When the bailiff called us back into room 4C, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of tension. The reporters who had smelled a scandal were now leaning forward, their pens poised not for a story of fraud, but for something far more explosive. My parents walked in like they were heading to a funeral. My mother's eyes were rimmed with red, her poise completely shattered. My father walked with a stiffness that made him look a decade older. They didn't sit with the same arrogance they'd had that morning. They sat like people waiting for a verdict they already knew they couldn't survive. Justice Sterling entered the room, and the silence was absolute. She carried a thick manila envelope marked with a bold, red, classified stamp. She set it on the bench with a heavy thud that echoed like a drumbeat. She didn't say a word at first. She just opened the envelope and began to read through the documents. I watched her eyes move across the pages, seeing her face soften as she read the field reports, the commendations, and the medical logs that detailed every injury I'd sustained while trying to save her and the others in our unit. The room felt like it was holding its breath. The court has received the declassified personnel file of Specialist Elena Vance. Justice Sterling began, her voice resonating with a power that made the walls seem to vibrate. These records, which were withheld from public view due to the sensitive nature of the 4th Provisional Task Force, confirm every detail of the defendant's service. They detail 3 years of active combat duty, a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in the line of duty, and a Bronze Star for valor. She paused, her gaze sweeping over to my parents, who seemed to shrink under her stare. The records also indicate that the defendant's identity was protected under a ghost protocol, a security measure intended to protect the families of those serving in high-stakes medical extraction units. Ironically, it was the very system designed to protect her family that her family chose to use as a weapon to destroy her. The plaintiff's attorney stood up, his voice cracking. Your Honor, in light of these new developments. My clients wish to withdraw their complaint. They realize there has been a profound misunderstanding. Justice Sterling slammed her hand on the bench. A misunderstanding, counselor. You sat in this room and called this woman a phantom. You called her a liar and a thief. You attempted to use the legal system to strip a combat veteran of her dignity and her livelihood. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a betrayal of the highest order. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw tears shimmering in the eyes of the woman who had once told me don't stop while she was bleeding out in the dirt. This case is not merely withdrawn, it is dismissed with prejudice. And I am ordering a full investigation into the plaintiffs for filing a malicious suit and perjury. This court is adjourned. I didn't move as the room erupted into a low, chaotic hum. The sound of the gavel was still ringing in my ears, a final heavy chord that signaled the end of my life as a ghost. People began to filter out, casting sidelong glances at me, some with newfound respect, others with the lingering voyeurism of those who had just watched a family implode. My parents stood as if paralyzed. My mother reached out a hand toward me, her fingers trembling, her lips quivering as if trying to form the word Elena. But I didn't look at her, I couldn't. The woman she saw wasn't her daughter. It was a stranger she had helped create through years of coldness and a final, desperate act of litigation. I stood up slowly, feeling the phantom weight of my gear one last time. As I adjusted my suit jacket, my father stepped into my path. He looked smaller than I remembered. The towering figure of authority who had once demanded I don't embarrass, the family was now just a man in an expensive suit that didn't fit right anymore. "Elena, listen," he started, his voice a pathetic shadow of its former self. "We were told. We were led to believe that the records were fake. We only did this to get you help, to bring you back to us." It was the ultimate gaslighting, a final attempt to frame their cruelty as a misguided act of love. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in my life I felt nothing. No anger, no yearning for his approval, just a hollow, echoing silence. "You didn't want to bring me back, Dad," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You wanted to bring back the version of me that was easy for you to manage. You wanted the girl who didn't have scars you couldn't explain to your friends at the country club. You didn't lose me in the war. You lost me the moment you decided that my truth was an inconvenience to your reputation." I walked past him, my heels clicking firmly against the marble floor. I didn't look back to see if they were following. I didn't look back to see my mother weeping into her silk handkerchief. I had spent years trying to find a way back into their world, only to realize that their world was a cage I had already broken out of long ago. As I reached the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, Justice Sterling was there, having stepped down from the bench. She had discarded her black robe, appearing now in a simple, professional suit. The authority was still there, but the Miri I remembered from the dust of Helmand was visible in the way she held her shoulders. She didn't offer a hug, we weren't that kind of people. Instead, she reached out and gripped my forearm, the same way she had gripped it 4 years ago when the world was ending. "Don't let this be the thing that defines you, Elena," she whispered. "You've survived the fire, don't let the ashes choke you now." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat that I refused to let break. "Thank you, Miri, for remembering." She gave me a short, sharp nod, the silent salute of those who have shared the unthinkable. I never forgot, I just didn't know who I was looking for until today. "Now go live, that's an order." I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, the heat of the city hitting me like a physical wave. The reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing, their questions a blur of noise. I didn't stop for them. I didn't give them a quote or a tearful interview. I just kept walking until I reached my car, locked the door, and sat in the silence. It wasn't the ringing silence of a blast anymore. It was the quiet of a blank page. I didn't stay in the city for long. The victory felt less like a celebration and more like a final shedding of old, dead skin. I packed what little I owned: the cedar chest with my uniform, a few books, and the framed discharge papers that had finally arrived with the official government seal. I moved 300 miles away to the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, to a town where the air was crisp and the people didn't know the name Vance. I found a small, weathered cabin that sat on a ridge overlooking a valley that filled with mist every morning. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed me to hear my own thoughts for the first time in a decade. I took a job at a small outreach center for veterans tucked away in a converted brick warehouse. There was no brass plaque on my desk, no title that announced my rank or my medals. I was just Elena. I spent my days sitting across from men and women who carried the same 1,000-yard stare I had worn for years. We didn't talk about the politics of war or the glory of service. We talked about the way the smell of rain can trigger a panic attack, or why the sound of a crowded grocery store feels like a tactical ambush. I became a bridge for them, a person who could look at their invisible wounds and say, "I see you, you are real." A few months into my new life, a letter arrived. It wasn't the thick, expensive stationery my father used to use. It was a plain white envelope with a local postmark. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and slightly out of focus. It was a shot taken from a distance, showing a younger version of me kneeling in the dirt beside a smoking vehicle, my hands buried in a medic's bag, my face a mask of fierce, desperate concentration. On the back, in a familiar, sharp script, were 4 words. The proof was always there. It was signed by Miri. She hadn't sent it to help me win a case. She had sent it to help me remember who I was before my parents tried to tell me I was nothing. I realized then that my parents' greatest crime wasn't the lawsuit. It was the years they spent trying to convince me that my experiences didn't matter because they didn't fit into their narrative of a perfect life. They had tried to gaslight the soul out of me. But as I looked at that photo, I didn't feel the old hollow ache of rejection. I felt a solid, grounded sense of peace. I had survived the war, I had survived the betrayal, and I had survived the silence. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the sun dip below the mountains, turning the sky into that familiar, bruised purple I had described in the courtroom. My brother Julian tried to call once. I watched the phone vibrate on the wooden table, his name flashing like a warning light. I didn't pick up. I didn't hate him, but I also didn't have anything left to say to that world. He belonged to a life of polished surfaces and strategic truths. I belonged to the mountain, the mist, and the raw honesty of the people I served at the clinic. I let the call go to voicemail, and eventually the vibrations stopped. The silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was mine. I had finally earned the right to choose who got to hear my voice. One evening, as the shadows of the pines stretched long across my porch, a man walked into the clinic just as I was locking up. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of rigid posture that shouted Marine, even before I saw the faded eagle, globe, and anchor tattooed on his forearm. He had a scar that ran from his ear to his collarbone, a thick white line of history. He didn't ask for a brochure or a counselor, he just stood there looking at me with a steady, unblinking gaze. "You're the one," he said, his voice like gravel. "The girl from the news, the one whose own blood tried to call her a ghost." I didn't flinch. I didn't get defensive, I just nodded and invited him in. We sat in the quiet of the office, the only light coming from a small desk lamp. He told me he'd driven 2 states over because he'd spent 20 years being told by his own family that his nerves were just an excuse for being lazy, that his medals were just pieces of tin he'd bought at a surplus store. "I saw what that judge did for you," he whispered, his hands shaking slightly as he rested them on his knees. "And for the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like I was crazy, I just wanted to see if you were real." I realized then that the trial hadn't just been about my life, it had been a beacon for everyone else who was being erased by the people they loved. We talked for 3 hours. I didn't give him professional advice, I gave him the truth. I told him that the people who haven't walked through the fire will always try to tell you that the heat isn't real. I told him that his worth wasn't tied to their belief in him. When he left, he shook my hand, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he smiled. It was a small, weary thing, but it was there. That night, I sat on my porch and looked at the stars. I thought about Thomas and Elena Vance. I wondered if they were sitting in their immaculate living room, staring at the empty chair where I used to sit, wondering where they went wrong. Or maybe they were still blaming the system or the biased judge for their public humiliation. It didn't matter. The tether that had connected my heart to their approval had finally snapped, and instead of falling, I was flying. I had spent so long trying to be the daughter they wanted that I had forgotten I was the woman the world needed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, heavy coin. It was a challenge coin I had received after a particularly brutal extraction in the valley. On one side was the emblem of my unit, on the other the words "in tenebris lux, in darkness light." I had carried it through the war, through the hospital, and through the courtroom. It was a reminder that even when the world tries to extinguish your flame, the spark remains yours to keep. I squeezed it tight, feeling the cold metal press into my palm, and I knew that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The seasons in the mountains changed with a quiet, honest rhythm. The vibrant greens of summer faded into the fiery reds and golds of autumn, and eventually, the first dusting of snow settled on the ridge. I found that I no longer measured my life by the milestones my parents valued. I didn't care about tax brackets, social standing, or the polished perfection of a Christmas card. I measured time by the progress of the veterans who walked into the clinic, by the first time they made eye contact, the first time they laughed without looking over their shoulder, and the first time they admitted they were proud of who they had become. My name is Elena Vance, and for a long time I believed that I was a broken thing that needed to be fixed. I thought that if I could just get my parents to see the medals and the papers, they would finally understand the weight of the girl who came back. But the mountains taught me something different. They taught me that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It sits like the ancient stone beneath my feet, unmoving, undeniable, and indifferent to whether anyone believes in it or not. I stopped looking for my reflection in the eyes of people who were blinded by their own shadows. One morning, a final package arrived from the city. It wasn't from a lawyer or a relative. It was a small wooden box, and inside was my original combat medic patch, the one they had cut off my uniform when I was loaded onto the medevac. It was stained with the dust of a country thousands of miles away, and the edges were frayed from the blast. There was no note, but I knew the handwriting on the shipping label. It was Miri. I held the patch in my hand, feeling the rough texture of the embroidery. This wasn't a piece of evidence for a courtroom. This was a piece of my soul that had finally found its way home. I walked out to the edge of the ridge, the cold mountain air filling my lungs. I looked out over the valley where the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the world in all its raw, imperfect beauty. I wasn't the girl who had left that house at 18, and I wasn't the ghost who had sat in courtroom 4C. I was a survivor, a witness, and a healer. My story was no longer a secret, but it was no longer a burden either. It was just the foundation of the life I was building, stone by stone in the quiet light of a new day. As I stood there, I realized that my parents hadn't just failed to see my service, they had failed to see the miracle of my survival. But their failure was no longer my weight to carry. I let the wind take the last lingering traces of their voices, their judgments, their lawsuits, their coldness. I turned back toward my cabin, toward the heat of the fire and the work that waited for me at the clinic. I am Elena Vance, I am a veteran, I am a daughter of the fire, but I am finally truly at peace. The silence is no longer an erasure, it is a sanctuary.